Hi everyone, how are you doing? My name is Raja Mukerji. I am the co-founder and the chief scientist of ExtraHop. Now, my intention over here is just to take you through an overall primer, if you will, as to what we do and more importantly, why we do it. It's not intended to be a vendor pitch. I know you hear plenty of those. And it's also not intended to be overly preachy or me just droning on. In particular, one thing that I'll as I go through this presentation, I hope I'm not going to be reading slides. In fact, I know that we're all literate, and if you need the slides, I'll send them over to you. Just drop me an email. I'm raja@extrahop.com. But my intention over here, as we go through this, is to speak a little bit, not necessarily about the company I represent, but more about why there's a need to understand the network in security. Now, I know that sounds a bit 101. I mean, network security security in cyber really started with the network in the first place. But it's fallen out of favor over the last, say, 10 to 15 years. And the point I'm going to make over here is that it hasn't fallen out of favor because it's lost value, but it's fallen out of favor because the complexity associated with securing a network has exceeded the traditional tools that people bring to bear. And what I mean by that is if we take a look at, for example, let's take a look at IDSs today, right? I mean, people have IDSs not necessarily because they bring tremendous value, but because compliance dictates that they have to have it. So in a world where your traffic's encrypted, we see people trying to apply plaintext signatures to encrypted traffic. It doesn't work. It's not going to work. But still, the auditors will come down on us and say, hey, thou must have your IDS. And therefore, we have to have it. And ultimately, the people, the front lines, the people who are actually trying to drive value from these products, they're the ones left holding the bag as they're sold tools that don't actually work. Similarly, let's take a look at packets in a network. I think every single one of us in operations, security operations, network operations, even business intelligence operations, understand that to truly understand what's happening inside the enterprise, you need to know what's happening inside on the network. And that's not me just being admittedly biased. The bottom line is how many of us have been in the situation where we've received that war room call at 3 in the morning and everybody sits around and says, my tool says it's not me, or everything's green over here, find somebody else. And ultimately it's the network engineer who comes out or the network security guy who comes out and plugs in some sort of device and starts looking at the network and figures out what's going on. The bottom line is the network is the polygraph of the enterprise. Packets don't lie. They tell the truth. If you really want to know what's actually happening, don't look at what devices are telling you. Take a look at what's actually happening. And the network is unique in the enterprise because it's not a self-reported thing. You're not asking a device, hey, are you secure? It's like going to, the equivalent in a medical scenario would be going to a doctor going to a patient and saying, hey, are you unwell? Well, the patient's going to make their own mind up about that. Whereas if you have a situation where the doctor's able to run a holistic test, then you actually know. And that's what the network is to the enterprise. Now, let's talk a little bit, technology is my friend. Let's talk a little bit about what's actually happening in the threat landscape. As I mentioned, what's really happened over here is that there's a certain class of attacks that are starting to occur right now that are evading the methods that we've sort of adopted over the last 10 years. I'm not going to come out with some sort of bold, attention-grabbing statement like EDR is dead, because of course EDR is not dead. EDR is an essential part of a defense in-depth strategy. But if we take a look at various techniques used by our friends Scattered Spider, for example, what they're doing is they are owning sites, regardless of whether they're completely patched, whether everyone does everything right. You can have all threat containment, all vulnerabilities patched, be completely hygienic in every single sense of the technical word. But you still get hacked by these folks. Why? Because ultimately what they're doing is they're stealing credentials, legitimate credentials, credential harvesting, and then they're replaying them. And there's, as we all know, there's literally a marketplace on the dark web and various other places where people are stealing these credentials, these signed credentials, and they're selling them and they're keeping the sessions alive. So we see cases where, for example, someone will steal a SAML token, and then what they'll do is they'll take that SAML token, they'll put it in a bot, and they'll keep on keeping that token alive until somebody goes and buys it, and now somebody's logging in with a stolen, completely legitimate token. Now, EDR can't pick that up. Why? Because the token is completely valid. Nothing went wrong. It was simply replayed. The device itself, the domain controller, the Kerberos station, if you will, that won't pick it up either. Why? Because the target signing request was perfectly legit. It issued it. It was told, it authenticated it, it signed the token, everything's good. But what actually went wrong here when you take a look at Scattered Spider? Well, a token was taken, it was shipped somewhere else, and then emitted from another device that may or may not have had EDR. It may not even be watched. I mean, it might not be coming through a ZTNA or a Zero Trust proxy. It comes from a completely different part of the environment. So then, what's the only thing that can pick it up? It's actually the network. The network can pick it up because it can see that the device to which that token was issued was not the place from which it was replayed. Now that sounds like 101 stuff again. It's pretty basic. But the bottom line is, if you're not watching the network, you don't get to see the fact that there was an anomalous transfer or a lateral movement of that token. And that's what these folks, our friends Scattered Spider and all these APTs are doing when they're moving laterally across the network, because they're owning sites and then they're moving laterally, taking advantage of the blind spots inside the environment. I'll posit that if you understand the network, you're going to have far fewer blind spots. The second thing I'll also mention is, I know that all of us, through the pandemic, we moved to a work-from-home model, if you will, where everything was sort of pushed through Zero Trust proxies. It was all pushed north-south. And I'm not going to say it was deliberately misleading, but what really happened was we fooled ourselves into thinking that east-west was gone. That from now on, everybody is going to start working, from home, and all their traffic is going to move to Zero Trust proxies, north-south. We don't have to worry about east-west. But the problem is, east-west is here to stay. East-west is not going away anytime soon, because if you take a look at anything that was built for convenience, it uses discovery. If something uses discovery, it's going to move east-west, it's going to use a broadcast domain, it's going to actually automate things. So when we start using PowerShell remoting, for example, when we start using anything that discovers another device, if you use an Apple Watch and use it to connect to an iPhone, it's talking east-west as the devices discover one another. This is not dead technology, it's not legacy technology, this is multicast discovery. This is the way a large number of protocols in discovery and clustering protocols work in the first place. East-west is here to stay. And so by telling ourselves that everything has moved north-south, what we've done is we've actually opened the surface area for living off the land attacks, where somebody comes in, PowerShell remotes a script. Now, I'm not saying that PowerShell is bad, but I will say that the current state of the art, the current tradecraft, doesn't involve us running malicious scripts. Oh no, that's too easy. But what it does involve is us running a script that loads a second stage loader, if you will, that then side loads something else, a malicious payload, then that gets executed. Why is that dangerous? Well, number one, PowerShell remoting is in Microsoft environments all runs with MSRPC, which is Kerberos encrypted. That key is actually issued on the domain controller. And so when we take a look at that, if we try to understand what's happening on the wire, if we don't understand Microsoft decryption, then we're blind to this opaque blob running around. Then on top of that, we take EDR. If we take EDR, well, guess what? That payload itself, that payload didn't actually ever hit the disk in the first place. And since it didn't hit the disk in the first place, we can't tell what that payload was doing. It was all reassembled inside memory. Again, the only place that data, that malicious payload can be observed is when it's in flight, when it's moving across the network, if you can decrypt it. And the third place, if we take a look at advanced supply chain threats, take a look at what happened with SUNBURST. The solution over here is not to cross our fingers and hope that SolarWinds or the vendor, I'm not trying to pick on SolarWinds, but hope is not a strategy, right? So we can't just hope that the vendors are going to be transparent about what happened. These are cases, if we want to try to understand what's happening in these environments, we actually have to understand what's moving across the wire so we know what is happening versus what it's spec'd as, because these two things differ. I mean, there's a reason that CMDB integrity inside in the enterprise is an average of 30%. The as-built differs from what's actually happening, and it's getting worse in a dynamic world, as every single thing we see, every time somebody launches a container, every time somebody runs Kubernetes, again, you've got a virtual dynamic workload that's trying to be tracked by static systems. That's not necessarily an indictment of the intent, but it is an indictment of the attempt of the methods we're trying to use to manage our systems today, and it is resulting in insecurity. So, what does this all boil down to? Well, right now, what we see is that about 41% of attacks that we see where successful breaches are bypassing existing defense systems. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's not a question of, this is not a question of, let's go back for a second here. And again, when I give these examples, it's not intended to call anybody out. I mean, these are breaches that happened. They could have happened to anyone. These are mature teams. They haven't done anything wrong. But let's take a look at that Target breach of 2013. Where did the bad guys come in from? From an HVAC control system. What EDR are you going to run on that? We see cases almost every day, malware running on MRI machines, on embedded Windows. You can't patch them. You can't patch them because you can't put a CrowdStrike agent, you can't put a SentinelOne agent on these devices, because now all of a sudden you've got that FDA reclassification. If your driver accidentally, upped the radiation a few angstroms, that would not be a good thing. So ultimately what happens over here is we're in the situation where you've got these defenses, but they're just not enough. And it's not just HTTP. I mean, once upon a time, a number of years back, everyone was talking about SSL VPNs being something that would protect you against everything. SSL VPN here and there. Why? Because IPsec was hard to deploy or whatever nonsense reason they had. But the bottom line was that everyone was talking about HTTP. They were talking about SSL. They were talking about these protocols, and whatever they implemented wasn't enough. Indeed, right now, if you have an SSL VPN in your enterprise, your insurance rates are going to go up because it's considered an insecure conduit to the enterprise. And we see cases where if we're simply trying to use web-based protocols, we're seeing organizations get hacked. I mean, very frankly, we've all seen exfiltration over DNS. We've all seen these problems that we see with Active Directory. It's not enough to just say, oh yeah, well, if it's SMB, we'll just trust something else, or if it's RPC, well, we just trust it. We're seeing too many examples, whether it's PrintNightmare or the BloodHound suite of attacks or what have you. We see too many cases where these protocols are just not, the protocols that are addressed in traditional IDS, in traditional NDR, they're just not good enough. So what are we supposed to do about it? Well, the bottom line is, one thing that we have to understand is that these attacks that are occurring, the successful attacks that are occurring, it's no longer smash and grab. I mean, I'm dating myself here, but when I was early in my career, a hack basically involved somebody coming and running some script kiddie running a script against some public-facing PHP script, if you will, or CGI that was sitting on a public-facing web server, running it, getting a root shell on the device, hopping in and defacing a website. And that was it. And now what we're looking at is people who are getting in, stealing a credential, keeping that credential alive, and then just hanging out, doing absolutely nothing. These Salt Typhoon attacks that occurred, in many cases, they took 9 months. They got in and they sat there patiently waiting for 9 months before they actually detonated it. The reason is there's multiple reasons. Number one, they're patient, they're not in a rush. Number two, they're waiting to make sure that their malware and their backdoors get nicely backed up on your backup systems too, so that when they're restored, they get right back in again. That's what we see right now. So if we take a look in these cases, Marriott, they were breached for 4 years. Hewlett-Packard, somewhere between 2 and 5 years. Even AT&T, 8 months. And so we can't simply keep on looking at firewalls and endpoints and saying, hey, we're covered. Yeah, you might be compliant, but compliant is not the same thing as covered. Secondly, trusted systems. Look, I'm not here again to peddle FUD and talk about how we can't trust anything or give you all that kind of nonsense. But what I will say is that implicit trust of any particular system is going to result in pain, because again, it's not, you can do everything absolutely perfectly and then some moron is going to read out their two-factor auth code over the phone. We've all seen it. It just keeps on happening. And finally, when these bad guys get in, one of the tragedies, if you will, with incident response is that the the first thing in incident response, the first part, is when they realize that the incident, or when the bad guys realize that the incident responders are in, they start covering their tracks. So the first thing an incident responder will do is that they will shut down the site. So you're in this impossible situation where you have to choose between availability of your site and security of your site. And that's no good for anyone. In fact, legislation is making it worse. Right now, the SEC has this rule that you're supposed to declare within 3 days of the detection of a material breach. What's material? Well, it's what a reasonable person would define as material. So consider this situation. You've got a breach, or you think you have a breach, and you're a CISO. And the SEC is breathing down your neck, and they say, look, if you suspect that something's wrong, you have 3 days to declare it. So if you're right, let's consider firstly the case where you suspect it, but you're not sure. So what do? You call in the cavalry. Incident responders show up. The first thing they do is they shut your site down. And now the SEC wants to know what happened. Why do you have a material revenue loss? Who knew about it? So they came down on you because you were wrong. If you're right, on the other hand, well, at this point in time, your brand suffers because your site was insecure, and now there's another inquisition as to why your site was insecure in the first place. The bottom line is, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. So you need a solution that allows you to identify whether there's something wrong, whether or not, without having to take the site down. It's really that simple. Why do you have to take the live patient, shoot him in the head, and perform an autopsy when you can run that MRI? And that's the situation that we find ourselves in today if we're not using the network. Because with the network, if you're looking at it off a span port, if you're looking at it off a tap port, you actually can perform that live analysis without shutting everything down, unlike situations with EDR, unlike situations where you're harvesting logs. Because in those cases, you do have to shut down everything so that you can instrument each endpoint. And when you're instrumenting the endpoint, the bad guys can see that you're doing it. The other thing I'll also mention, I know that everybody's talking about AI absolutely everywhere. I mean, my eyes glaze over when I hear people talk about AI. It drives me to distraction. It's so irritating. I mean, at the beginning of this craze, I received this email from a phone provider who said, hey, we're rebranding everything to something AI. I mean, I could mention the name of the company, but I don't necessarily want to name and shame too overtly. But they're just renaming everything, and there's no fidelity anymore in the process because everyone's just calling everything AI just for the fun of it. But what I'll point out is threat response is actually a field that doesn't just benefit from the buzzword AI. It actually needs AI. And the reason for it is around 2010, if you take a look at the attack sophistication versus the relative level of knowledge, there was a convergence point around 2010. And you can measure that by the amount of time, the volume of attacks versus the amount of time to clear an alert. Your average SOC analyst, when provided with a non-noisy, genuine, well-filled out ticket, will take about 8 minutes per ticket to close out the ticket, to confirm or deny. Of course, if you confirm it now, you escalate it, you've got various things you have to do, but just an initial triage, it takes about 8 minutes. Unless you have machine assistance in doing that, that is just far too long. So one of the things that we talk about is when you actually understand the entire landscape of an enterprise, if you're not using machine learning, then you're already on the defensive. Now, when we talk about attack volume, and this is a place where I'll say, take this with a grain of salt, because these are some analysts who came up with these numbers. But what I'll say is when they say 4.8 billion attacks detected daily, that could be anything. It could be like, I don't know, it could be a ping bomb, it could be a port scan, it could be an actual attack of a zero-day exploitation attempt. But either way, the bottom line over here is that without machine assistance, it's impossible to keep up with it. The other thing I'll also point out is if you take a look at breaches, actual breaches that have been identified and confirmed by a reasonable person, the average time between detection or between infiltration or the I guess the right term would be the initial exploitation to the breach is about 287 days. Now, there's many numbers around this. Ponemon once said 231 days. Cisco now says it's 91 days. There's all these things. But the bottom line is we're not measuring it in seconds. We're not measuring it in 8-minute increments. We're measuring it in days. So the need for that full coverage, the need for machine assistance is incredibly important. And I already mentioned that they have about 8 minutes per alert. So ultimately, the reason we recommend the network as that point to understand the enterprise is, number one, if you take a look at the MITRE attack chain, for example, what we're really looking at over here is we're looking at a situation where moving from that initial, the initial discovery all the way to the action upon objective. If we take a look at everything there, you can see every single aspect of the attack chain on the wire. The network is the only thing that will show you everything that occurs, including that lateral movement as data is staged for exfiltration. Secondly, if you're looking at the network and you have an instrumented network, it is the ultimate vantage point. It doesn't have those blind spots from the HVAC or from the device or third-party devices. Do you remember over here? It was in Caesars. It was about 2 years back. It was over at DEF CON. What they'd done is that was the point at which they'd figured out exactly some vulnerabilities in the MyFair hotel access cards. And what somebody had done is they'd helpfully gone around all the elevators inside Caesars and they replaced the scanners with skimmers. So you'd tap your MyFair and now you'd have some uninvited guests potentially showing up in your rooms. And the bottom line over here is the footprint of that would not be picked up by any EDR. However, you could see that on the network as it connected across and moved that payload across once that card was tapped. And finally, when you take a look at what's actually happening on the network, it's not a case where you set it up and you forget about it. This is not like you're setting up a fixed rule. What you're doing over here is you're looking for anomalies in behavior. If something is anomalous, you can see that anomaly on the wire. And ultimately, one thing I'll also point out is signatures, they're just not enough. Looking at HTTP, it's just not enough. It's actually understanding the behavior and what it represents. So when I talk about, for example, identity, when I talk about somebody who may have issued a ticket from somewhere that got signed somewhere else and then moved, the question is what's normal? And what's normal can be picked up if you understand the pattern of life on the network. This is, again, the reason, I'll have to underscore this, the reason the network has fallen out of favor is because it's got two properties that make it really, really hard in today's dynamic world. And I think my next slide will explain what those two things are. Well, here's number one. The first one is there's a lot of vendors out there who will walk around and talk about the fact that you don't need to decrypt traffic to understand what's happening on the wire. They'll claim multiple reasons. They'll say it violates privacy. They'll say it breaks certificate pinning. They'll say you need a copy of the private key. Let me tell you something. All three are wrong. All three are wrong. And the reason network vendors are not decrypting traffic is because it's difficult, not because of any of these things. If it's your network, you get to see what moves across your network. Just as if it's your laptop, nobody sits around and says, you can't run antivirus on your laptop because it's a privacy violation, because it looks at your files. Of course it looks at your files. That's the point. If you run a network and it is your network and there are your transactions running it, you should be able to look and see. By the way, there's a lot of vendors out there who will also talk about, you can guess what's in the traffic. We have heuristics that'll guess what's in the traffic. To that, what I'll say is, if you end up in Frankfurt Airport and you hear two people yelling at each other in German, and you say, you know what? I know what they're saying. They're speaking German. Well, great. How does that actually help you? Without knowing specifically what's inside the transaction, without understanding the intention, there is no security. And so when we talk about the need to decrypt is driven, number one, by the need to understand what's happening inside the transaction. There is no reason that you should not be able to look at the traffic that's on your network, passing your transactions to your devices, serving your customers. I mean, I'm not talking about going on a fishing expedition, but it absolutely should be the case that you can do that. And thirdly, this argument about we need the private key, it's false. And I'll actually admit to being one of the people who is responsible for that misperception. You see, before starting ExtraHop, I was the chief architect for F5 Networks, where we built a controller called Big IP. And that was a high-speed SSL decryption device, amongst other things. And the way we did it initially was we had SSL offloaders where we took the private key from customers, and we loaded the private key on this thing, and it would speed up the SSL transaction. The thing is, if you're watching traffic, you don't need the private key. All this stuff with TLS 1.3 and perfect forward secrecy, you don't need the private key. You need the symmetric key, because SSL has two stages. SSL has the asymmetric exchange, and then SSL has the symmetric key transfer. If you look at the symmetric key, you don't need the private key. And so we just need, if you have a solution that just takes the symmetric key, you don't need to break pinning. You don't need the device in the middle. You don't need to man in the middle of this thing. It'll just work. And that's what we've implemented in our company. We've implemented a solution that allows people to look at the contents of SSL traffic if they have control over one of the endpoints, either the server or the client, without breaking pinning, without breaking affinity, and you don't need to share your private key. PCI DSS passed. So it's not this case where SSL is infeasible. The vendors are not doing it because they don't know how to, or because it's difficult. They're lazy. They're running on antiquated architectures. That's why they're not doing it. And so, to end over here, well, the other thing I'll just mention, I know this is not my slide. The other reason that people aren't using the network is because of the volume of attacks or the volume of alerts. You see, if you're running a SIEM, a busy SIEM will give you a few thousand events per second. If you're running on a network, you're looking at 150 million to 200 million packets per second if you're on a 10 gig, on a 100 gig network. That's an immense amount of work, and those traditional Bro-Zeek architectures can't keep up with it. You have to really have a re-architecture from the start. And your traditional high-speed operating systems and kernels, anything that does any sort of bounce buffering or copying of data, it's not going to work at all. So it does require some specialized kernel engineering in order to get that to work. Ultimately, as I mentioned though, I'm not here to pitch my company. I am pitching the approach we take. The bottom line is we do believe that the network is the ground truth. It is the polygraph of the enterprise. It provides you with real, actually what's happening rather than guesses and self-reporting. Secondly, we believe that the network is comprehensive, regardless of whether it's an HVAC or an IoT device or an IP cam or a phone. The bottom line is it will talk on the network. You don't need an EDR on it. You don't need the thing to log. And finally, when we talk about proactive and resilient, this is a case where you don't have to shut down the environment to figure out if you're breached. And that is very, very important, both in terms of proactively determining if something's wrong and being resilient so you didn't shut down the site before you started figuring out what went wrong. We're ExtraHop, extrahop.com. There's a strange and funny and quirky story about why we named the company ExtraHop. Let me tell you one thing. When you're a startup and you're two engineers who start a company, in our case, 18.5 years back, you sort of look at each other and say, what do we name the company? And we say, okay, how much does, what's memorable? And what can we get the domain for cheap? We spent $12 on that domain, it's stuck, and here we are stuck with this code name 18.5 years later. I will say that in the early days, when we called people up, we had people say, look, you're either total morons or absolute geniuses for calling your company ExtraHop. So it did get us a call, or it got us somebody picking up the phone. And you know what? We'll take it. The bottom line is, thank you again all for coming. My email address is raja@extrahop.com. If I can answer any questions, I'd be happy to. And again, my intention is not necessarily to sell, but it is absolutely to evangelize why we can't ignore the network in today's threat landscape. Thank you again.